Yo, what?
Always, always,
Likewise.
always. It's been a
Likewise.
minute since we've seen each other in person.
Yeah, I think we've been doing, the Zoom thing, but yeah, it
The
has been some
Zoom.
time now. So
Yes.
you're looking well.
Thank you. Thank you. You are too. Praise God.
Indeed, God gets all that glory. Gets nothing but grace and mercy. So congratulations. I am so excited to hear that you are running for Secretary of State.
Yes.
So
Very exciting. I will say it is certainly a challenge that we've decided to take on this race, but it is definitely a worthwhile fight, as they say. When I think about just all of the work that we've been involved in, from an advocacy standpoint, in
right.
community, working with community, all the issues that we've sought to advance, all the victories that we've
Yes,
won.
yes.
What has become very clear to me is the very important role that the Secretary of State's office has to play in helping to accelerate that advancement, right? And it's, oftentimes when people think about the Secretary of State, they think of, if they know anything,
Right.
they think about like voting,
Right.
right? The advancement of voting rights, which is critically important. But the reality is the Secretary of State has responsibility for really the full spectrum of democracy, right? So it's not just voting rights and access. It's how we engage with government, what type of information we have access to. If you've got a nonprofit here in Massachusetts, you have to engage with the Secretary of State's office. If you've got a business here, you got to engage with the Secretary of State's office. If you've got a 401k, right, or any type of retirement account, you have an interest in who is sitting in that seat. And so there are so many points on the democracy spectrum that the Secretary of State's office has responsibility for. That I believe that this office, quite frankly, needs to be one that we all know about, that we all understand its role, and most importantly, it needs to be an office that's working with all of us to strengthen our communities. So to make it really simple, when we think about democracy, we should think about community, and communities are made up of people. And so democracy is really about us as people, how we engage with one another, how we engage with the government and other institutional structures. And all of those are important to the many issues that folks in community are fighting, all the issues that we're fighting for. So whether we're talking about your public education, right? So this is a statewide office. So with the exception of Boston, everywhere else, folks get to vote on their school committee members, right?
Okay.
And so that's voting on who gets to be on the school committee. The Secretary of State has a role to play in that because it touches voting, right? If we're talking about issues related to the development of housing, for example. Oftentimes, those decisions around zoning and other measures are decided by elected officials. You want to be an elected official in Massachusetts, you got to go through the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State has a role to play, not just in who gets to vote, but also who gets to be on the ballot and therefore who gets to run for office. My net on this, Pastor Hobbs, is that this is an office that for entirely too long, too many people don't know very much about. While at the same time, it is an office that has such an important role to play in what's happening in our communities today. And I want to see it be an office that is a better community member, that is a better partner, and that is providing more support to our communities to help enliven them and to strengthen them.
617-282-0685, 617-282-0685. You can also write us at 670 Washington Street, Dorchester, Mass. 02124. Should you have a question for candidate Tanisha Sullivan, running for Secretary of State here of Massachusetts. If you want to communicate your sentiment in our instant chat room on our main webpage, www.bostonpraiseradio.tv, that would be great as well. But we're here and have our guest who is here to answer your questions, to hear your feedback as she is running for this seat. Now, William Galvin has been in this position for, I believe, like 30 years.
Almost.
Not quite.
27.
27.
He's going for more.
So what is the term?
4 years.
4 years.
So it's on the same. So this is great question. So this is a statewide office. And so it's similar to the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. These are offices that folks might be more familiar with. Treasurer, auditor, and secretary of the Commonwealth or secretary of state. Those offices are constitutional offices. So they are the senior most offices in our state government, and they're for the entire state. The terms are for 4 years. Okay. They are executive offices, so that means that they are offices that are similar to others in the executive branch, like a mayor is an executive officer, a governor is an executive officer, a district attorney is an executive officer, right? So they're executive officers. So they've got the ability to make decisions, right? They've got the ability to make decisions independently, right? Independent from, independent from a court or independent from the legislature. But they have also, in my opinion, the responsibility to work with the legislature and certainly ensure that they're in compliance with the judiciary, any judicial decisions. This is an office that, let's talk a little bit about what it covers. So voting rights and access. The Secretary of State is the chief elections officer in Massachusetts. So what that means is anything having to do with voting, this office has oversight responsibility for. Now, I gotta shout out our local elections officials because the work of, that happens, like when you actually go to cast your ballot, those are the local election officials that take care of that. That's your local city government that is responsible for that administration. Okay. So they're the ones that make sure that things are running smoothly, but they have, as a support, the Secretary of State, who's looking across the state to make sure that everything is going well. Okay. On the voting rights piece, I believe that we need a Secretary of State who is more of a vocal advocate in the advancement of voting rights. We know today across the country, folks have been waiting for Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, for example, and that hasn't happened. And in other parts of the country, Texas and Florida, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, there have been very active attempts to suppress the vote and to take our rights away. But here in Massachusetts, we also have a bit of a fight going on that not so many people know about. And that's a fight that is happening today in our legislature around the Votes Act. Now, the Votes Act is a piece of legislation that we hope will become law that has in it some pretty basic voting advancement rights. So, for example, it's got mail-in balloting. A lot of people might have become more familiar with mail-in balloting during the pandemic because in 2020, that's the way most of us voted for safety reasons. What people might not know is that that's not new. And in fact, many advocates here in Massachusetts have been fighting for us to have the right to mail in our ballot with no excuse. We just want to mail it in for decades. Okay. And there are already about 31 other states. So the majority of states already offer mail-in balloting. In Massachusetts, we don't have that yet permanently. Our legislature is debating that today. What's also in there is same-day voter registration. Same-day voter registration is something that voters in 21 other states around the country already have, including all of the New England states. So New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all have some form of same-day voter registration, some form of it. In Massachusetts, we don't have that right. And what same-day voter registration does is it basically says, if you're eligible to vote, you got the right to vote. In the most simplest terms, you can wake up on election day and you can go register to vote and cast your ballot.
That's great.
Same day voter registration means that we're pulling down barriers to be able to access the ballot box. In Massachusetts, we're still debating that today.
And practical story. I know Pastor Wall, we're advocating for people to vote. Pastor Wall in our church is really activist about having people be engaged. And so, and encouraging someone to do that. And someone, I don't know if it was a returning citizen or something of that nature, but the person said, okay, I'm going to do it. And they came to the church. They were all excited. And Pastor Wall went with them to the polling place. They were all excited. And they were not registered. And so they could not vote. And had that been the case, they would have been able to cast their ballot.
That's right. And that's that's a wonderful story about the importance of a same day registration. For me, I believe, and I come at this as from a civil rights seat, right? I believe that if you've got the right to vote, we should be doing everything in our power to ensure that you can access the ballot, whether you decide that you want to vote 10 months in advance, or you decide you want to vote 30 minutes before the polls close. Anything we can do to help encourage people to be a part of this process, we should be doing. And so as Secretary of State, the type of Secretary of State that I'll be is someone who's going to champion that. Now, Pastor Hobbs, I'm an advocate. So I'm a fighter. I'm vocal. I'm right on the front lines. I'm not the person who just says, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Let me know how that works out. If I'm leaning in on something, I'm really leaning in on it. And so as Secretary of State, I will do the same. It should not take us here in Massachusetts a decade or 2 decades to have some of these basic advancements. We should have mail-in balloting, vote by mail, and it shouldn't be a debate. We should have same-day voter registration, and it should not be a debate. But we need someone who's going to be a vocal advocate to ensure that happens, and that means working with the legislature, not saying, oh, it's the legislature's responsibility, okay? The other piece that is contained, one of the other pieces contained in the Votes Act is, I know, an issue that is near and dear to your heart, and that is helping to ensure that those who are behind the wall who have the right to vote actually have the ability to cast a ballot. Okay. And so contained within the Votes Act are some requirements to help ensure that folks who are behind the wall on pretrial detention or for a misdemeanor who have the right to vote can actually cast that ballot.
That's right.
Again, I start from a very basic place here. If you got the right to vote, our system should be set up to allow for you to do so. Why is that important? That's important because when we look at the data, like voter turnout data, one of the things people might hear is, oh, we're doing great here in Massachusetts. We got, in 2020, 76% of registered voters cast their ballot. We're great. Nothing to see here, folks. All good. That's the aggregate number. Okay. That's the overall number. When you start to actually peel back the layers and look at the data county by county, or look at the data municipality by municipality, city by city, something interesting happens. In communities of color, Black and brown communities, in immigrant communities, in working class communities, in low income communities, the numbers drop.
Sure.
Okay? And that's a consistent drop. And what people will say is, oh, that's because they're not interested in voting. They don't want to vote. They've got the right, but they're choosing not to. I don't believe that. Because too many of us have fought, bled, and died for that right. Okay? We understand the importance of it. There's something else happening there. And what we know, those of us who have worked in community, those of us who have rolled up our sleeves and been in community working through issues with folks, what we know is that when you've got that type of data that's consistent in showing those types of gaps, it is emblematic of, it is symptomatic of, it is a reflection of something is structurally wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay? And so for me, I'm looking at the Secretary of State's office and saying, it's not enough for this to be the office where people go to register to vote. It's not enough for this to be the office where, okay, we get a report out on the election numbers. That's not enough. That's administrative. That's transactional. That's bureaucratic. What we need is a Secretary of State who, yes, is reporting the data, right? So we know, that the number and is doing it with integrity. So we know we can trust the numbers. But we also need a Secretary of State who understands that the job doesn't end there. If you're the chief democracy officer in Massachusetts, and that's what the Secretary of State is, then if year over year we're getting data showing us that there are specific communities that are consistently voting at a high rate, and there are specific communities that are consistently voting at a lower rate, we need a Secretary of State who's going to say, we got to fix that. What are we going to do to fix that? What are the structural barriers that need to be moved out the way? Because a chief democracy officer cares most about participation. Whether that's participation by casting a ballot, or it's participation by being a member of a neighborhood association or a ward committee or a community-based organization. That's what someone who is a champion of democracy cares about. And I'm running for Secretary of State because I am a champion of democracy, and I want to be the chief democracy officer in Massachusetts, and I want to see an office of Secretary of State that cares about our communities, that cares about our people, and believes that we can have a strong, vibrant democracy that works for all of us with the appropriate supports.
Outstanding. In Massachusetts, we know that people who are returning citizens are specially qualified. A term which is interesting that in the process of doing voter registration, I actually learned, and it was interesting because even the Irish commissioner at that time, who did not know that was the case. And it's interesting because a young lady, Rakia Edwards, I'll never forget, a guy always gives you a little angel who was a black woman inside the clerk's office who just ran and made sure, because there weren't a lot of us in the office, and she would run and she'd make certain that every T was crossed and every I was dotted to make sure that particularly our returning citizens' ballots were not getting, or applications were not falling through the cracks. And so if we had to go back and forth, what we had to do to make sure that we got it right. And so in the process of doing that, we saw in the small print on the back of the absentee ballot that it says returning citizens are specially qualified. Hence, don't actually have to, the requirement of having to register 20 days prior to vote does not apply to returning citizens because they're specially qualified. So they can just participate by absentee ballot. But with that said, again, None of that. One, people didn't know that. He didn't know it, and he said, "Let me research it and find out." And he came back and sat right in that seat and said, "You know what? You're absolutely right." And so I so appreciated that. We don't necessarily know, but when he did not know, he said that is fact. And so then we challenged the Secretary of State's office to be able to communicate to every sheriff's office, as well as to every elections department, that they are specially qualified. And so now with that, what we're doing is that we have a ballot box initiative working with State Representative Nika Elugado and Sheriff Tompkins to draft the legislation. But the hope is that upon classification, so coming in, just as I think there's something called a modernization, or that's a capacity underneath the Secretary of State, or the modernization of the elections, or is that just something that we did when we were actually in the process of we were at Morning Star Baptist Church and we were talking. We had some breakout groups, and I think that may have been one of the
election modernization. So there is an election modernization coalition. It's actually a group of advocates outside of the system, right? Driving to modernize our voting laws here in Massachusetts, because in Massachusetts, we've got to modernize our voting laws. Like, we're not even at the advancement stage yet. We're still trying to catch up. So, yes, that is work that is ongoing.
Okay.
That is work that's ongoing.
Okay, but that's something outside of the preview of the Secretary of State's capacity specific, but you could work with these groups, you're saying, to do that. So,
actually, I'm glad that you raised this point, because the Secretary of State is the chief information officer in the Commonwealth, because access to information is part of a strong democracy. Typically, when people talk about access to information, it's about, do academics have access to information for research purposes, write books, for example? Do journalists have access to information to report out the news? What's not talked about as widely, that I think is equally as important, is access to information for regular folk, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
Okay. Regular people, right? And so for me, I believe that this office has a role to play in not only ensuring that everyday people in communities and neighborhoods across Massachusetts have access to information, but actually are provided with the supports to know how to use the information, because that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Folks think that it's okay to say, well, you have the right and it's written somewhere.
Sure.
In these thousands of volumes of pages, you got some rights in there.
Right.
We gave them to you. Good luck.
Exactly.
That's not power.
No.
That's not empowering.
No.
And that's not reflective of a strong democracy. So that's something that I do believe needs to change from as it relates to the role of the Secretary of State.
So with that said, I understand right now, for just as you're saying, mail-in ballot applications are something that they're trying to make in law now. They will get them. Just anybody who's registered, they mail it to your house, right? Almost to your name. And you have the opportunity to be able to complete that or not, but it's really proactive, right? We almost have to opt out. And so what I'm saying is, a person who is incarcerated, they are under the custody of the sheriff, and the sheriff cannot, as it stands, we were hoping they could electronically communicate their roster to the Board of Elections and say, these are all the people who are eligible. They could then complete an absentee ballot application, put it in a box, and mail it to the respective returning citizen. But that we found out, let me see who this call is. Is going to try to go on the air. I think they probably are. I was going to hope we put their right on.
Okay.
Caller, you are live on the air. I hope you wanted to go on the air. And this is something that hold on. No, it's not something to go on the air. Just talk a moment.
Okay. Pastor Hobbs said, Tanisha, just go on and talk. Well, actually, it's a great point to stop. It is important when we think about all of these offices, whether it's a governor or it's a lieutenant governor or it's a Secretary of State, we need all of these offices to take a more active role in our communities. We need all of these offices, quite frankly, to be better community members, right? Not separated from community, but working with and in community. Because that's really how our government is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be us and them. It's supposed to be a we. And so for me, when I think about the office of Secretary of State, there's no other office in our government, in our state government, that has a greater role to play in ensuring that our government is engaging, is a better community member than the Secretary of State's office. The other piece I want to share is the important role that this office can play in the advancement of economic opportunity. Now, we know Dr. King said that the inextricable twin of racial justice is economic justice. And so it's important for folks to understand that here in Massachusetts, if you want to do business here, if you want to set up a business, if you want to start a nonprofit, you got to go through the Secretary of State. And today what that means is you go there to register your business, you go there to file annual reports, and you go there to pay fees. It's very transactional in nature, very administrative in nature. And that's it. I believe that there's an opportunity for that office to provide greater supports specifically to our smaller nonprofits and our small micro Main Street businesses. And that can be done very easily by having a link, for example, on the website. So when you go to register your business or you go to pay your fees, you can also be connected to the Supplier Diversity Office to gain access to grants and financial supports to help your business thrive. Or you can be connected to community-based organizations in your own backyard that can help to provide you with technical supports as you're getting started in your business or as you're trying to build capacity in your business. My point is that the current office, the way that it has been operated, is very stagnant. Mm-hmm. It is about transaction. Mm-hmm. It is about administration. Mm-hmm. It is it's bureaucratic. Mm-hmm. And in 2022, we need an office, all of our government offices. Yes, okay? Yes. We need them to be dynamic. Yeah. We need them to be engaged with us. We need them to be working for us and supportive of us. Mm-hmm. We need a Secretary of State's office that is focused on identifying more ways to open up opportunity in our democracy for all people. Mm-hmm. Whether you are here in Boston, or you're in Pittsfield, or you're in Lanesboro, Massachusetts, or you're in Fall River, right? Wherever you are, folks should know that this is an office they can count on, an office that is here to help strengthen our democracy, which means that it's here to help strengthen our communities, which means that it's here to help empower people. And so that's in part the vision that I have for this office. And it is what I hope can serve as a beacon for the rest of the country for what democracy can look like. And if that's the case, not only do we have a strong democracy here in Massachusetts, but we're actually carrying a leadership mantle across the country.
It's outstanding. Yeah, I'm really, really inspired, and I do agree that there's so much, that office could do. I wonder, has the office ever been held by a woman of color?
The office has never been held by a woman or a person of color.
Wow.
Ever.
How did I know that? Ever. Always white men.
Yes. Make it plain, Pastor.
I'm just saying, right? Listen. So we're going to, wow, never a woman or even.
And imagine that. When we think about democracy, oftentimes we do think about the power of women and the role that women have played in this country, strengthening this country, oftentimes carrying on our backs this country, right? And here we have the Chief Democracy Office, and there's never been a woman helping to guide our democracy and ensuring that it is inclusive, ensuring that it is vibrant and strong, right? We think about voting rights and the advancement of voting rights and who's been on the front lines throughout the history of this country, fighting to ensure that we all have the right to vote. It's been women and it's been people of color.
Absolutely.
And so while I know personally, we all know personally as women, those of us who are women in community, those of us who are people of color, know the importance of democracy. Absolutely. We know the opportunity that exists in democracy. And we know what's possible.
Yeah. You know, I'm particularly, as you've already stated, I'm concerned about those, the least of us, particularly our returning citizens. And so many black and brown and poor folks we know, unfortunately, get caught up into that system. And there's such brilliance that is not engaged. And so it's tragic that the infrastructure is not in place across the country. But let's start with the Commonwealth. So a lot of things you said look on paper, sounds great. They're specially qualified. That sounds really great. But again, one, if they don't know it, what does it mean? Two, if the infrastructure is not in place for them to be able to do that, then it's just something that looks good. I know that there's the African American Coalition Committee that's doing a lot of advocacy from behind the bars, and quite candidly have gotten many elected officials in, like State Representative Nika Elugado, like District Attorney, now U.S. Attorney Rachel Rollins, Congresswoman Presley, Liz Miranda. The list goes on and on, who will tell you directly have relationships with some of these organizing groups for brothers who are behind bars, who are advocating for people who can vote, who are here. And so our hope is that, one, ultimately that felons will get their rights restored, because that was what case here in Massachusetts at one point, that felons actually could even vote, who were actively serving felony convictions. I don't know what your feelings are with that, but I think, again, your freedom is being taken from you. The fact that that you're not having an opportunity to continue to engage in your democracy, I think is something that you still should have the right to.
Yeah, I mean, look, mass incarceration, it has been well documented, the impact of mass incarceration on communities of color, specifically the black and brown communities, and how mass incarceration has been used as a tool to really strike at the root of our communities, to deconstruct our communities, to disrupt our communities. And so when the 13th Amendment, right, was put in place, okay, specifically, right, to as a tool.
Which still exists today, correct?
Oh, the 13th Amendment.
And that blows, and for those who don't know, because I learned right here on this broadcast that the 13th Amendment states, and help me, but my understanding, I'll let you tell it, because I don't want to say it wrong.
So, the 13th Amendment speaks to freedom, right? This is why folks can be incarcerated, and in certain parts of the country can be required to, perform labor for free, okay, in certain parts of the country. And so, when we think about basic rights that exists in this country, freedom is the number one right, okay? But one of the other fundamental rights that we have as citizens is the right to vote. And so anytime that right is taken away, it should cause alarms to go off for all of us. We should all be saying, okay, if you have a right to vote in this country and that right is being taken away, we should all be on high alert to say, why is that happening? Does that need to happen? And so I do believe that, just as mass incarceration has physically removed folks from our communities as a result of the prohibition on voting for those who are incarcerated on a felony, it's also removing the voice from our communities, right? The power of that vote from our communities. As we think about kind of the evolution of these conversations around voting rights, my hope is this. One, that here in Massachusetts, we actually modernize our elections. We catch up with the rest of the country on some of these basic voting rights, like vote by mail and same-day voter registration, so that we can also get to the advancement of voting rights, which means getting into the conversations about what democracy should look like in the future and what voting therefore should look like in the future, right? So conversations like, I was a co-chair for ranked choice voting here in Massachusetts, Rank the Vote. I'm a believer in ranked choice voting. Disappointed that it didn't pass, that the ballot question didn't pass in 2020. But excited that the conversations are still happening in municipalities around Massachusetts. And ranked choice voting, for those who don't know, very simply put, is a way to vote that helps to ensure that the person who wins actually has a majority of the support. Okay? Ranked choice voting. It's like, gives you the opportunity to vote for people just like you would select your ice cream flavors if someone was running to the store for you, right? If you're not going to the ice cream shop and they're like, what you want? And you're like, oh, butter pecan. But if they don't have butter pecan, I want cookies and cream. And if they don't have cookies and cream, just give me straight vanilla. Right? So it gives you the opportunity to rank your vote. If this one isn't available, I'll take that one. If that one isn't available, right? And at the end of that process, you end up with a winner who has the more than 50% of the support from folks. I love the concept because it helps ensure that more people are likely to support the person who gets into office. We need to have more conversations about ranked choice voting. We need to, I think, have more conversations about lowering the voting age in municipalities. Giving our young people the opportunity in their cities and towns to vote. Why? Because I believe that we need to start cultivating a culture of civic participation in Massachusetts. We need to start instilling in our children the importance of participating in our democracy, civic engagement. And we do that through education in our schools, but we also do that through the practical application. And so what better way for a young person to learn about democracy than to be given the opportunity in their own community to actively participate in it, make some decisions about it. You know, it's also one of the reasons why I support, you know, the student member of the Boston School Committee having a vote.
Absolutely.
Why not? And so I do think that we need to open up these conversations so that we here in Massachusetts can be part of the advancement of voting rights for other parts of here in the country, so that we can serve as an example for what an active, engaged democracy looks like.
What are your thoughts with regard to undocumented, our brothers and sisters actually having the right to vote? There's some conversation, legislation around that. A
lot of conversation around that. And there again, I think, you know, part of the problem I have with the issues around the advancement of voting rights is that people shut down conversations before they even get started. Right? It's like out of fear. Out of fear. Conversations get shut down. That's not what democracy looks like. I graduated from the University of Virginia. It's all about, public debate, public dialogue, right? Wrestling with tough issues, not taking the easy way out. The easy way out is shutting down the conversation before it gets started. And so I do believe that we need to have conversations about who has the right to vote and at what point, right? So if we're talking about, for example, folks who are on a pathway to citizenship, having the conversation about what it might look like, particularly at the municipal level. I think that it's important for us to also look at these issues through an intersectional lens. The fact of the matter is we've got an immigration system that's not working. We have an immigration system that is structurally broken.
Absolutely.
So you've got folks who have been waiting a very long time, done everything right, sitting on the sidelines, waiting for Congress to get its act together to help ensure that we've got a clearer path to citizenship, and all the while not being able to actively participate by way of casting a ballot. So and that's a significant impact. And those are the types of things that we've got to, I think, factor into the conversation. But most importantly, Pastor Hobbs, we got to have the conversation. We need to have the conversations in our communities at the municipal level, and we need to have the conversations at the state level. It's one of the things that that today I'm a strong proponent of, and that I look forward to helping lead as Secretary of State. More of these discussions, debates, dialogues that are designed to advance our democracy, strengthen our democracy, and create a more inclusive democracy as a result.
Back to the with the returning citizens. Again, we're looking at some of the models of places that have done some of this and trying to replicate, tweak, see how we can do it here. But my understanding is, as it stands right now, that so people who are incarcerated could not, the sheriff could not just communicate the roster to the Board of Elections, because the initiative has to come from the returning citizen themselves to request it, right? And that there's that would actually, but the Secretary of State, I believe, would have the ability to be able to change that without us having to do a law. Like, back to your point about the executive power that the Secretary of State has, and I'm not certain if this is the case, but I believe that might be the case.
So there has been conversation about what you're getting to, and it wouldn't just apply to those who are returning or those who are behind the wall. It would apply to anyone who's registered to vote. There has been conversation about whether ballots should be proactively mailed to registered voters. Okay. And again, one of the things that I'm excited about is that at least folks are having conversation about it.
Sure.
It's important to know that there are, I think, legitimate questions that get raised around ballot security.
Sure.
Right. And ensuring that, if you're mailing a ballot, that it's getting to the intended recipient. Right. And thinking about what are the things from a security standpoint we need to consider. For me, one of the other kind of innovations that I hope we will get to is, I think, better use of technology in the process. Right. And so when we think about security, what we know is that here in Massachusetts, we have some of the most brilliant minds in the world when it comes to technology. And some of the most innovative researchers out there, and technicians and engineers in the world. What I'd like to see is bringing more of that talent into the conversations about what the future of voting looks like, so that we can balance certainly the access to the ballot with very understandably very important concerns about ballot security, because we've got to do both.
Sure.
History has shown us, that if we don't do both,
right,
we can end up with, for some, unintended consequences, and for others, very intended consequences.
Absolutely. If one is interested in being able to support your campaign or to learn more about your specific platform as Secretary of State, how would they do that?
You can visit our website at TanishaSullivan.com, TanishaSullivan, TanishaSullivan.com. I meant to mention this earlier. So we're in the process of convenings to help us develop our democracy agenda. We will, I can't believe it's creeping up. April is next week. In April, we will be inviting more folks kind of into these conversations, giving folks an opportunity to react to the policy, to the democracy agenda, which is comprised of our policy positions, so that together we can co-construct not only the policy platform, but also the priorities for this office. So folks should visit TanishaSullivan.com. That's our launch site. Our campaign site will be up in the next few weeks, but visit TanishaSullivan.com, and there you can, certainly you can donate from there. Right. Yes. But also you can sign up to be a volunteer or to get on our mailing list so that you can stay up to speed on ways to engage with the campaign.
Wow. And the election is actually
September 6th.
September 6th.
September 6th. September 6th. Right. We've got to come up with something. Right. See, too bad it's not, September 20th, because then we could bust out some Earth, Wind, and Fire. So we're going to have to come up with something else. But it's September 6th. Okay. It's the day after Labor Day. And so hopefully our legislature will pass the Votes Act and we'll have vote by mail so folks can mail in their ballots. Okay. But if not, definitely need to remind people that Election Day, it's the primary day, is September 6th. And what's really important is that it will be what they call a partisan primary. So it's not like the municipal election. Okay. Whoever wins on September 6th wins. And that person will go on to the general election in November. Okay. That's different than like the mayoral races or the city council, where it's like the top two or the top four. Right. This is winner take all.
Okay, September 6th.
September 6th. So folks might remember in 2018, this is like the race that Congresswoman Presley had. Yes. You remember? Yes. She won in September, and we were like, okay, good. Right. Like we won.
Yes.
You remember that? It's like that. Okay? And so it's really important that folks mark their calendar for September 6th. I definitely I ask for your vote. I'd love to have your support. The doors of the campaign are open for volunteers because truly, we're not going to be able to do this without support.
Absolutely.
And that applies not just to the election, but it applies afterwards, because what I've described is a shift
major
in how this office operates, right? And so that's going to require that, yes, please vote for Tanisha Sullivan for Secretary of State on September 6th, but also after we win, we need all of us also participating in actively participating in our democracy.
Yes. Thank you, Tanisha Sullivan, for Secretary of State. Well, now I'm just curious, what with your capacity as president, how will that have any kind of bearing one on the other?
So this is an election year for the NAACP Boston branch. We are in the process of looking for an executive director for the NAACP. So if folks are interested in perhaps working for the NAACP, most of us are, actually all of us are volunteers. I'm a volunteer with the NAACP. This is a volunteer role, but we do recognize the need to have someone who's on staff for the branch. So if folks are interested in applying for that role, they can contact us at info@naacpboston.org. Okay. I was trying to think, another way that you can contact the branch is by visiting the website, bostonnaacp.org, but again, actively recruiting for an executive director.
Thank you again, Tanisha Sullivan, and thank you. We'll be right back in just a moment.